It started as a suggestion from my husband Ryan over coffee one Saturday morning. "Why don't we shake things up a little?" he asked casually, as if he were proposing we try a new restaurant for dinner. I looked at him, a bit confused but intrigued. After all, we had been together for almost a decade, and even though our relationship was stable and comfortable, there was an undeniable sense of something missing, something unspoken. He didn't explain immediately. Instead, he proposed an experiment that would bring new energy into our lives. He hinted at stepping out of our comfort zone, at trusting each other in a way we hadn't before. While the thought made me uneasy, his sincerity and excitement made me consider it. Ryan rarely pushed for things like this. The idea stayed with me long after the coffee cups were empty and the morning was over. By the following weekend, Ryan had arranged a meeting with 3 of his old friends, men I'd never met, who he assured me could be trusted. "They're harmless," he said with a reassuring smile. "They're good guys." The idea of having strangers around was unsettling. I didn't know what to expect, and Ryan didn't elaborate on what he wanted from me. But his insistence that this was about exploration and trust made me want to go along, even if only to understand what he was trying to show me. Later that evening, when the doorbell rang, my heart raced. Ryan opened the door to welcome the 3 men inside. One by one, they stepped into our living room, each one polite and well-mannered. There was Andrew, a quiet man with a thoughtful expression. Sam, who seemed a bit nervous himself. And David, whose warm smile put me at ease almost immediately. They were friends of my husband, not strangers entirely. But to me, they were still unknown. The 5 of us sat around, chatting politely at first, making small talk. I felt awkward and uncertain, but Ryan kept giving me reassuring glances. The more we talked, the more I started to realize that these men weren't just here as his friends. They were here to play some part in whatever Ryan had planned. As the evening unfolded, I found myself analyzing each of these men through cautious glances, feeling like I was being pulled into something far beyond my control or understanding. Andrew had a quiet, introspective nature, rarely speaking unless he had something meaningful to add. His calm presence was oddly comforting, though I could tell there was more to him than he let on. Sam, on the other hand, was the opposite. He seemed anxious, a bit out of place, and I sensed he was as unsure about all this as I was. David, however, was different. Charming and personable, with an ease that made him instantly likable. I couldn't help but wonder why Ryan had chosen them specifically. Ryan poured each of us a glass of wine, his excitement barely contained. As he handed me my glass, he gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze, almost as if he sensed my nerves. "Relax," he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "Trust me. Trust me." Those 2 words felt like an anchor holding me steady, but they also made me question everything. In all our years together, Ryan had never given me a reason not to trust him. But this situation was different. It wasn't just the presence of these 3 men, but the lack of clarity. I felt like a stranger in my own home, unsure of what was expected of me. What did trust mean here? Did he expect me to open up to them in some way I hadn't before? As the night went on, we fell into a strange but comfortable rhythm. I shared a bit about myself, and they, in turn, shared parts of their lives. Small details about their jobs, their interests, snippets of their pasts. It was like peeling back layers of strangers I hadn't asked to know, uncovering little truths that made them feel less like Ryan's friends and more like individuals with stories of their own. But the real tension was in the silences, the glances exchanged between Ryan and me that spoke volumes. At one point, I asked Ryan quietly if he could explain what exactly he wanted me to do. His eyes softened, and he took a deep breath. "It's not about doing something specific," he said. "It's about letting yourself be seen, letting go of control and letting others see a part of you that's hidden." His words lingered in the air, weaving around my thoughts. Ryan knew I had always been reserved, cautious even in our marriage. He had often encouraged me to let my guard down, to trust him more openly. But this felt like more than that. "So, what do you want from them?" I pressed, my curiosity getting the best of me. "It's not just about me," he said, and his gaze flickered to the men. "I want you to see how you respond when the walls come down, even just a little." It was a strange request, almost intangible, something I couldn't define. Yet there was a part of me that wanted to understand it. I took a sip of my wine, letting it dull the nervous energy simmering within me. I could feel their eyes on me, each one holding a different expression, a different layer of intrigue. David leaned forward, breaking the silence. "So, what about you? What's one thing you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" The question caught me off guard. I looked at Ryan, half expecting him to intervene, but he simply gave me a slight nod, urging me to answer honestly. I paused, considering what to say, feeling the weight of their attention. "I've always wanted to feel free," I said finally, the words slipping out before I could stop it. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered, and admitting it out loud surprised even me. I don't know what that means exactly, but sometimes I feel limited, like I'm holding myself back. Andrew nodded thoughtfully, his eyes full of understanding. "It's normal to feel that way. We all have parts of ourselves that are hard to reveal." He spoke with an unexpected gentleness, as though he had been in my shoes before, trapped between safety and the need for something more. As the conversation flowed, I found myself sharing pieces of myself I had rarely spoken about, not even with Ryan. There was something strangely liberating about speaking with people who didn't know my every move, who didn't see me in the same familiar way. For the first time in years, I felt seen, almost alive. I could feel Ryan watching me, but it wasn't possessive or jealous. It was something closer to pride, as though he were watching a transformation unfold. I didn't know what was happening or where this would lead, but I felt a shift within myself, a loosening of the tight hold I had on my emotions. The fear that had gripped me earlier was fading, replaced by a strange exhilaration. For once, I didn't want to question it. I just wanted to let it happen. As the night grew late and our glasses emptied, the air grew thicker with something unspoken. A feeling of anticipation, of something on the verge of happening. Ryan caught my eye again, his expression soft, almost vulnerable. In that moment, I understood. This was about trust, but it was also about permission. Permission to feel, to let go, to explore parts of myself that had been buried under years of routine. And for the first time, I was ready to take that step, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The following days were a blur of thought and reflection, each moment replaying the night over and over in my mind. It was strange how a single evening could linger, as if it were asking to be understood. I found myself thinking about each of the men individually, their faces, their questions, and the conversations that had struck me on such a profound level. Ryan didn't bring it up the next day, as if he knew I needed time to process it. But he watched me closely, studying me in a way that was both endearing and unsettling. We had talked about trust, about freedom, but I felt I was barely scratching the surface of what he intended with this experiment. And yet, I could feel myself opening, questioning things about myself that I hadn't dared to confront in years. A week later, Ryan suggested meeting up with them again, this time outside the house. I hesitated, wondering if it was wise to continue, but there was a part of me that wanted to see them again, wanted to understand what had been stirred inside me that night. Maybe the answer wasn't in avoiding them, but in embracing this strange situation. That evening, we met at a quiet restaurant. The setting was more formal, and seeing each of them in this different environment made it feel almost like a surreal reunion. Andrew, Sam, and David greeted me warmly, their smiles genuine. Ryan stayed by my side, his hand resting gently on my back as we settled into the booth. We made small talk for a while, but soon the conversation took a familiar turn, one that felt almost magnetic, as if we were all drawn to it. "Have you thought more about what you shared with us last time?" David asked, his gaze steady. I nodded, feeling a little exposed. "Yes, actually," I admitted. I keep asking myself why I feel so restrained, even when I shouldn't. And I think it's because I've been afraid to look too closely at my own desires, my own needs. The words were surprisingly easy to say, and as I looked over at Ryan, I saw the same quiet encouragement in his eyes. The atmosphere shifted, a current of energy passing between us all. It felt like stepping onto thin ice, knowing it could break at any moment but trusting the people around me to keep me steady. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes kind. Sometimes we don't know ourselves until we're faced with new perspectives, new people who can see things in us we might have overlooked. His words resonated, and I realized this wasn't just about trust in Ryan, it was about trusting myself. For years, I had felt that my identity was bound to the stability of our marriage, to the roles we had both settled into. But here, with these 3 men and my husband watching me grow, I felt a freedom to explore who I was beneath those roles. Ryan noticed my pensive silence and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to hide from this," he whispered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. "I want you to embrace it." I felt a surge of something unnameable, a mix of nervousness and excitement. There was an intimacy here, a vulnerability that went beyond anything I had experienced before, and it was liberating. I wasn't bound by expectations or routine. I was free to just be myself, and they were willing to see me as I was. No masks. We spent the evening talking more deeply than I could have anticipated, sharing stories of missed opportunities, past regrets, and hidden dreams. Each of them revealed parts of themselves that felt just as vulnerable as my own admissions. David spoke about his struggle with self-doubt, how he had always felt like an outsider even among friends. Sam shared his battle with living up to expectations, how he felt confined by the image he portrayed. And Andrew, in his quiet way, spoke of his fear of never being truly understood. Their honesty touched me, weaving an unexpected connection among us. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was something raw, something real. I realized then that I had stepped into a space where I could connect without pretense, where I could let go of the self-imposed barriers that had kept me in a box for so long. But even in this moment of liberation, I felt a flicker of fear. What did this mean for my marriage? For my relationship with Ryan? I looked over at him, trying to gauge his reaction, and found him watching me with a mixture of pride and tenderness. There was no jealousy in his gaze, no insecurity, only a deep understanding that made my heart ache with gratitude. As we left the restaurant, Ryan pulled me aside, letting the others walk ahead. He looked at me with a depth I hadn't seen before, as if he were seeing me for the first time. "You know, I didn't expect it to feel like this," he admitted, his voice soft. "I wanted you to have this experience, to feel free, but seeing you open up like this, it's made me realize something." "What's that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That I've been holding on to you too tightly," he said. "I was so afraid of losing you, of us getting stuck in routine, that I didn't let you explore who you could be outside of what we already have. I thought this would be good for you, but it turns out it's helped me too. I want you to have that freedom, even if it means letting go a little." His words left me speechless. I hadn't realized how much weight he had been carrying, how much of my own fear he had absorbed to protect me. But here we were, standing on the edge of something new, something that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, as we walked to our car, I felt a strange sense of peace. I looked back at Andrew, Sam, and David, who were laughing together by the entrance. They had come into our lives as strangers, but now they were part of this journey. A journey I hadn't expected, but was now ready to embrace. Ryan squeezed my hand once more, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger than before. In the weeks that followed our night out with Andrew, Sam, and David, life seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm. But inside, I felt anything but ordinary. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. I no longer felt as though I was playing a role or suppressing parts of myself for the sake of comfort. Ryan and I, in some strange way, had both given each other permission to explore not only our individual needs, but also a new kind of intimacy that didn't rely on tradition or expectation. For days, I replayed our last conversation at the restaurant in my mind, thinking about how open and vulnerable we had all been. Ryan had allowed me to step into unknown territory, and instead of clinging to certainty, he had embraced my growth. This generosity touched me deeply. I realized I had been carrying fears of my own. Fears of failure, fears that stepping outside our comfort zone would somehow undermine our love. But what I found was the opposite. Stepping out of that comfort zone had only strengthened our bond. Ryan noticed the change in me too. I saw it in the way he looked at me, as though seeing me anew, as though every shared moment had a fresh electric energy. We talked more openly, without the usual caution that had once framed our words. He asked me about my feelings, about my past, my fears, and even my dreams, and listened as if each answer were something precious. We were both freer now, more honest, and I could feel a deep trust rekindling between us. One rooted not in fear of losing each other, but in genuine acceptance. One afternoon, about a month after that night at the restaurant, I found myself sitting with Ryan on our back porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the yard. I turned to him, feeling a need to put into words everything that had been stirring inside me. "Thank you," I said quietly, reaching for his hand. "For what?" he asked, surprised. "For letting me go even just a little. For trusting me enough to let me explore what I didn't even know I was missing." I felt a lump form in my throat. It made me realize how lucky I am to have you, to have someone who wants me to be myself, no matter what that looks like. Ryan smiled, his gaze softening. "I didn't do it just for you," he admitted. "I did it because I wanted us to keep growing together, and I knew that meant letting you see a part of yourself that you might have lost over the years." He paused, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "And I think I needed it too. To see who you are outside of just my wife." Hearing him say that brought a wave of relief and understanding. I realized that we had both been holding on to a version of ourselves that no longer fit. By allowing me the space to grow, he had found freedom too. A freedom that didn't threaten our relationship, but rather deepened it. As we sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a calm settle over me. The experience we had shared with Andrew, Sam, and David wasn't about attraction or desire. It was about discovering the parts of ourselves we had long ignored. In allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we had strengthened the foundation of our marriage, opening it up to possibility rather than constraint. The next week, we met up with the three men one last time, this time not as participants in some unspoken experiment, but simply as friends. We laughed and shared stories, reminiscing about the strange turn our lives had taken together. It was a bittersweet goodbye, but I knew it was necessary. Their role in our lives had been important but brief, an intense, transformative chapter that had run its course. And now, it was time to move forward with what we had learned. That night, as Ryan and I lay side by side in bed, I realized something profound. By facing the unknown together, by opening ourselves to a situation that defied convention, we had rediscovered each other. We had moved beyond the ordinary and into something new and sacred, a trust so deep that it felt like home. And that, I knew, was a gift that would sustain us through whatever came next. In the silence of that night, with his hand in mine, I felt a quiet sense of completion. Ryan and I had journeyed into the unknown and returned, not as changed people, but as people who had found the courage to be fully seen. And in that vulnerability, we had found something stronger than we'd ever had before. A love rooted in freedom, trust, and the quiet understanding that we were exactly where we belonged.